Welcome. With the presidential election less than 2 months off, we begin a series called Debate This, where we consider issues that somehow are off the campaign radar. Tonight, toxic chemicals. Later, we'll meet a recovering politician now writing a cautionary Dear Abby-like column aimed at New York politicos and their spouses. After that, we'll hear which political platform would deregulate the internet and see what that might mean for startups and anyone going online. Finally, we'll go spelunking, not upstate, but under Grand Central. First, toxic chemicals. Many citizens have asked, how come the federal government has regulated only a handful of chemicals when 80,000 are out there? Why, for example, is a chemical called BPA that's banned in baby bottles still permitted in other products? And how come suspect fire retardants remain in furniture? Jason Rano would like to hear toxic chemicals pinging loudly on the political radar. He directs government affairs at the Environmental Working Group in Washington, D.C., where he joins us via Skype. Welcome to the show. Hello from New York.
Thank you for having me.
80,000 chemicals out there, a public health issue, if ever there was one, you would think. Why isn't this on either presidential candidate's radar screen?
You know, I think partially a lot of consumers assume that if it's on their shelves, that it's safe. I think the other issue is a hurdle that we face in explaining it to consumers out there that, you know, consumers are used to food illness and things like that where the link is more direct. You eat something bad, you get sick. The effect from toxic chemicals, though there can be acute effects, the effects we're most concerned about are long-term effects to the reproductive system, neurodevelopment, and potential cancer.
But even with those things, they eventually show up in clusters if they're there, right? And you could tell that there's an increase in something and trace back that there's a link to people who use such and such a product, that kind of thing. So if we don't see those clusters showing up, then why shouldn't we assume that the things on the store shelves are safe?
Well, that's a question, whether something is safe, that has never really been answered for the majority of the consumer chemicals that are out there. In 1976, President Ford signed the Toxic Substances Control Act, which grandfathered 60,000 chemicals in, basically saying that they were safe. Since then, more than 20,000 chemicals have come on the market. And as you pointed out, very few have ever been assessed for safety. And that's really at the heart of what we're talking about. We need to be able to answer that question is this safe?
When you say 60,000 were grandfathered in, that means 60,000 chemicals used in products before 1976 were exempted from being tested?
Yeah, basically.
It's the opposite in Europe, isn't it?
Well, the Europeans are much farther along than us in this process. They have something called REACH, which requires vigorous data submission and allows the European Union to ban chemicals or restrict the use of chemicals. And that's where those are the principles that we're trying to carry over here and that Senator Lautenberg has put into his Safe Chemicals Act.
Senator Lautenberg from New Jersey, he's proposing what exactly?
He has been a leader for about a decade now on reforming the Toxic Substances Control Act. And basically what his bill, the Safe Chemicals Act, would do would boost EPA's ability to get important health and safety data, which is the first step to making a safety assessment, require EPA to actually make that assessment, require them to say a chemical is safe, restrict the chemical's use for certain uses, or ban a chemical outright. It would also limit the types of data that can be claimed as confidential by the chemical industry.
But it's not going anywhere in the gridlock Congress?
Well, historically, it passed out of committee earlier this summer. I think a lot of folks acknowledge that there's still some work to do, um, but it's an important step forward, and we hope that that momentum will continue.
Let's take some examples. I mentioned BPA at the top of the segment, which a lot of people know because it was in the news, and then it was banned from baby bottles and sippy cups. But what people may not realize after that is that it's still in a whole host of other products, right?
That's true. It was banned in BPA and sippy cups earlier this summer when the FDA granted the chemical industry's petition saying that they no longer use BPA in baby bottles and sippy cups. This was after 11 states and the District of Columbia took action to regulate BPA in baby bottles and sippy cups. But it is still found in receipts, can linings, and food containers. So yeah, it is still quite ubiquitous.
You said receipts. Somebody told me if I even go into, ironically, Whole Foods, chances are I'm going to walk out with a receipt that has BPA coated on it, right?
Yeah, and EWG actually did research on this about a year and a half ago, looking at BPA in receipts, and found it at grocery stores, found it at fast food chains, gas stations, and even in congressional cafeterias on Capitol Hill.
But why should I consider that a risk? Again, it's one thing if a baby with a developing nervous system is putting it right up to his or her mouth. If I'm just taking a receipt, which we tend to file or throw away pretty quickly, and we've got a developed, grown-up body, is that really something we should worry about of all the things to worry about in the world?
Well, there's two ways to look at it. First is look how many receipts you may take. And then think about the cashier whose job for several hours a day is to hand out those receipts. Second is it's not about necessarily eliminating just the BPA in receipts. It's about cutting down on the amount of chemicals that you and I and everybody else are exposed to on an everyday basis. And then take into account maybe women of childbearing age. And what we really want to do is just cut down on the amount of chemicals we're exposed to on an everyday basis.
By the way, I heard one version of the BPA ban for baby bottles that said that the industry requested it as kind of a loss leader. In other words, they realized that they were losing the public relations war on bottles and sippy cups, so they were going to take that hit in order to distract attention from all the other things that have BPA in them. It's kind of a conspiracy theory. Do you think it actually happened that way?
Well, I can't speak to why they did it, but certainly after 11 states, the 11th state being California, regulated or banned BPA in baby bottles and sippy cups, the chemical industry petitioned FDA saying, please remove this as a potential use because we don't use it anymore in baby bottles and sippy cups. So they definitely saw the writing on the wall. This was after spending many years and many millions of dollars lobbying against those same bans in those 11 and many more states where unfortunately they were successful.
Let's take another example, the chemicals that are used as fire retardants in furniture. Now, we would think on first blush that this is a safety measure. We certainly want fire retardant furniture. We don't want our furniture easily catching on fire in our homes through whatever might ignite it. So it's safety measure versus safety measure. Tell me about those chemicals.
So part of the issue is how California many years ago instituted a standard, which Governor Brown announced earlier this summer that they are reviewing and going to restructure. And basically how that was put together allowed for a certain amount of flame retardants to be in the furniture, not enough that actually proves to make a significant difference. And the idea behind this being that if your couch caught on fire, or God forbid, if your baby mattress or baby pillow caught on fire, that these chemicals would retard the flame long enough to escape. What studies have shown is that's not the case, but there is enough in a lot of these pieces of furniture to be linked to health effects. The other concern is for firefighters across the country, that when these chemicals do burn, they become highly toxic. And we've been hearing more and more about firefighters developing serious health effects due to them.
Is it true there was fake testimony around this issue?
Yes, earlier this year, the Chicago Sun-Times did a great multi-part series that revealed that the major flame retardant companies, both manufacturers and importers, started a fake grassroots group called the Citizens for Fire Safety. And actually, just that last week, they announced that they're shutting it down. But what came out in that Chicago Sun-Times series, is that Citizens for Fire Safety paid a doctor to travel and testify on their behalf in favor of flame retardants, and that this doctor made up stories about a baby succumbing to burns due to the lack of flame retardants in his crib.
Nice. Call out the fact checkers.
That's right.
Before you go, is there an Obama record on this? I mean, this may not be an issue that comes up in the presidential debates, but this president has been in office for 3.5 years. He's got an EPA and an OSHA and an FDA and et cetera. Is there a record?
Absolutely. The EPA under Lisa Jackson, who obviously was appointed by President Obama, has been one of strong advocacy for reform of the Toxic Substances Control Act. The EPA a few years ago came out with principles for TSCA reform, as it's known. But they've also continually worked to use their limited power under the act to take action, requiring more data, requiring more testing. They haven't always been successful, but they've been working very hard under her leadership, and also trying to work with companies and stakeholders like Environmental Working Group to see what can be done on a voluntary basis. Unfortunately, this is not a fully effective substitution for reforming TSCA, but in light of that not happening yet, it's the best we can hope for sure, and she deserves a lot of credit for doing that.
Well, thanks a lot for bringing us up to speed on an issue in our lives, in Congress via Senator Lautenberg, but not in the presidential campaign. We appreciate it.
Thanks very much for your time.
Up next, a recovering politician writes an advice column for New York politicos and their spouses. You may have seen the documentary about him, Can Mr. Smith Get to Washington Anymore? Or perhaps you heard his extraordinary story on public radio's This American Life. Jeffrey Smith, former Missouri State Senator, PhD in political science, is now teaching at the New School and newly writing a Dear Abby-like column for the website City and State. It dispenses advice to politicians and their spouses. The column is called Do As I Say. Note that it's not called Do As I Did because, among other reasons, Mr. Smith spent 2010 in prison for violating campaign finance laws. Jeffrey Smith has much to teach us, however, about politics and about life. Welcome to the program.
Thanks very much for having me.
A Dear Abby kind of column for politicians?
Yeah, no, it wasn't my idea, but after I met with the editor of City and State, he thought that, the way he put it, he said, I think you seem wise beyond your years, and maybe that's what prison will do to someone, but for a long time I had offered advice to younger people who had gone into politics. I've been teaching for about a decade, and so many of my former students went into politics either as staffers or as candidates themselves. So it's not an unusual role for me, and I'm quite enjoying the writing.
Not that I want to dwell on it, but just so people know, how did you get into and out of trouble?
Well, I'll try to keep it to 60 seconds, but when I was running for Congress in 2004.
In Missouri?
In Missouri, I ran for the open seat that Dick Gephardt had vacated. And during that race, an independent political consultant approached two of my aides. He said that he wanted to do a mailer about one of my opponents. I ran against, among other people, Russ Carnahan, whose father had been governor, his mother had been senator. Russ had had an abysmal voting record in the State House, and the independent consultant wanted to do a mailer about it. my aides came to me to get my blessing. Instead of telling them not to coordinate illegally with an independent operation, I told them that I didn't want to know any of the details. Later on, after I lost narrowly, Congressman Carnahan filed a Federal Election Commission complaint against me. I responded by filing a false affidavit saying that I didn't know anything about the mailer when I did know that my aides had met with the person who was responsible for it. And 5 years later, my best friend wore a wire for about a month and a half and got me to admit knowing something.
So this, first of all, it sounds like a horrible experience to have gone through. But secondly, this actually does relate to something that's extremely prevalent in our politics right now. I mean, I could imagine any number of politicians writing to your advice column to ask, so there's this independent group empowered by Citizens United that wants to support my candidacy because they hate the other guy because he's not in the interest of their special interest group. But I'm not legally allowed to coordinate with them, but they're coming to me. What do I do?
You know, the answer is stay as far away from possible, sprint in the other direction. No good can be, can come of any type of coordination at all. A lot of the presidential candidates actually tested the limits, kind of pushed the envelope on that during the primary campaign. I don't know if you saw, but Newt Gingrich, while Sheldon Adelson, the casino billionaire, was pretty much single-handedly keeping Gingrich's campaign afloat. Gingrich was having closed doors meetings with him in Las Vegas during the campaign. Rick Santorum's billionaire funding his super PAC was traveling with Santorum on the campaign trail for weeks on end. They were both telling reporters, oh, we don't talk about the campaign, I'm just here as a friend. So it was sort of stretching the bounds of credulity there, but the fact is, in campaigns all over the country this cycle, people are really testing the limits.
All right, let's take another example. One Paul wrote you asking, I'm running for office and I have nearly $100,000 worth of pledges, campaign finance pledges, hanging out there. I've tried calling people who pledged, but they won't take my calls. How can I get my money? What did you write back?
Well, one thing I suggested, kind of unconventional, I said go knock on their doors. And it sounds a little deceitful perhaps, but you're canvassing anyway. You're going out and knocking on doors. Well, find a neighborhood where 2 or 3 of your donors live and knock on their doors at the same time as you're knocking on anyone else. Another suggestion, which, and I know these might seem a little manipulative or Machiavellian, is to go to an office building at around 11:30 where a couple of your donors who have pledged work, and then just sit in the lobby because they're going to be coming down between 11:30 and 12:30 and going for their lunch date most of the time. And you'll run into them in the lobby and they'll say, hey, and I'll say, hey, they'll say, how's the campaign going? And you say, oh, it's going great, thanks for your support. And they'll say, I'm going to get you that check, because they haven't forgotten about it. So it's just
well, why would these pretty well-off people who you're describing make a campaign donation pledge if they weren't going to fulfill it?
That's a great question, but people do it all the time. And on a typical political campaign, usually, in say a congressional campaign, almost half of the money pledged never comes in. And so you can, improve your statistics to 60, 70, 80, 90%, but you're never going to get all the money in pledge because some people are just telling you what you want to hear, but don't really have any intention of actually sending the money. Other people mean it when they tell you, but things get in the way, things happen, and they just never quite get around to it.
Another letter said, I'm running for office, and though I have some volunteers, most come in once, then disappear. I asked my campaign manager why, and he said they were all flaky. Do you have any advice? You wrote back, first fire your manager.
Yeah, because no manager should ever blame the fact that volunteers aren't coming back on the volunteers. If they're not coming back, it's because there was something about the campaign that didn't attract them or bring them back. So I said, campaigns, the first thing you need to do is you need to make volunteers feel invested. You don't make them feel invested by saying, hey, here's a call sheet. I want you to go make 50 phone calls on that line over there, and then you can get some pizza back there. You make them feel invested by asking them, what do you want to do on the campaign? What's your dream job on the campaign? That's what we always did. If they said, hey, I'd love to help write a TV ad, then when we were in the process of writing our script for the TV ad, we would bring them back to have them give some ideas. Now, of course, in between those moments, they'd have to knock on a lot of doors or make a lot of phone calls, but we gave everyone a chance to do whatever it was they dreamed of doing on a campaign.
What kinds of politicians write to you? Probably not ones that most of the public has heard of. And do you take them anonymously? Do you publish them with or without names?
I publish them however they request to be published. Most people just want initials, and some want the city where they're from. Some people don't even want the city where they're from published because they're afraid someone will figure out who they are. But I have everyone. I had several people who are running for state representative or general assembly in their states have written in the last month. Someone who's planning to run for president of Venezuela wrote me last week. So, not sure if my advice translates internationally, but we'll see.
Another Paul wrote this to your column. I'm a legislator who screwed up. I promised a school superintendent in my district that I would vote against new charter schools, then told the charter school advocates that I would support their bill, which would allow for charter school expansion. What should I do? Oh my God, I would say to that guy, you deserve what you get.
Well, I think I told him, don't ever, promise two different people two different things ever again.
Yeah.
Which is pretty obvious. But secondly, I told him, what do you do actually when you're in that dilemma? Well, I said, you should go to constituents who you trust. Go find a dozen people in your district who are knowledgeable about the issue, but don't have a stake on either side. Because obviously, a charter school operator and a superintendent both have stakes. So find some knowledgeable people who you trust and ask their opinion. You're going to have to break your word to one of the two people to whom you gave your word. But at least if you do it that way, you can say, I listened to a lot of constituents and there was a consensus to go in the other direction, and that's why I'm doing it. And I said, secondly, make sure you tell them early, because the worst thing you can do to any interest group is for them to think they've got your support, and then they come up one vote short on the floor. So make sure you tell them early so that they can work whatever undecided votes they may have out there.
You give advice to spouses, too.
Occasionally, yeah, and a lot of staff people. So not just people running for office, but oftentimes the people behind the guy behind the guy or the woman behind the woman is often more influential than the candidate himself.
So did you watch Michelle Obama at the Democratic convention and think, man, this is the pinnacle of being an effective political spouse?
I was actually got to watch it in Charlotte.
Oh, wow.
In person, and
Were you a delegate?
I was not a delegate, but I did get inside and had a chance to watch her, and it was really, I think, the best performance by a political spouse I've seen in my lifetime.
And people forget that it was a political performance. I think so many people are touched by her personally that they forget that that was a very rhetorically sophisticated political speech.
Absolutely. And they also kind of forget when they say, oh, she was so much better than Ann Romney. They also forget she probably had a little bit easier job. I think humanizing Barack Obama may be a bit easier than humanizing Mitt Romney.
So what kinds of questions do you get from spouses?
Well, the top question I get is he ever going to be done with this? Is he ever going, he's been promising me for years that if he just got to the next level, he would spend more time with our family. Is it ever going to actually happen? So I've gotten that several times. A second question I get frequently is he ever going to be the person that he used to be when I first met him, when I first fell in love with him? Because unfortunately, as I'm sure you know from being around a lot of public figures, people tend to change when they get into public life. And a lot of the things that maybe aren't so important to regular people, the minutiae of politics, they become obsessed with them. And a lot of spouses are wondering, am I ever going to get back kind of the normal person who I fell in love with? And
then if that politician gets embroiled in a scandal, he'll eventually say, well, I'm quitting to spend more time with my family. You had apparently a very effective ground game, even though you narrowly lost to Carnahan. That was a multi-generation family dynasty. Here you were, a young guy, you almost won. Do you have advice to the presidential candidates for their ground games? Because that's what it's going to be now, of course, after the debates. It's going to be actually getting out the vote, maximize the people who have decided that they like them better, what they call the ground game, toward Election Day.
Well, far be it for me to offer counsel to the president's campaign, because that was in 2008. I think they put on the best grassroots campaign the country had ever seen. But what I think I would advise to Romney's campaign, Obama's campaign, any campaign, is that the more personal the interaction, the better. Having a phone call from a stranger doesn't work so well. Having a phone call from someone you know a little bit works okay. But but having a personal visit from someone who is intimately acquainted with the target voter is always the most important thing. So what I would suggest doing, and it's something I've always used to do and advised candidates to do, is find your best volunteers in a given precinct, and then go get the lists. You've been spending a year, actually for Obama's campaign, they've been spending 4 years, narrowing their lists to just the undecided voters. Take those lists of undecideds or maybe soft supporters and bring them to your 20 or 30 best supporters in every precinct and say, who do you know on this list? If everybody can just pick out 6 or 7 people they know on the list, then instead of those people getting a call from some zealous volunteer from 3 states away, they're getting a call from their buddy who they play softball with on Thursday night. And that's going to be easily the most meaningful interaction.
It means you got to really gear up in those states and get deep into those communities.
Very deep. But the Obama campaign, I can't speak for the Romney campaign because I'm not as familiar, but the Obama campaign has spent many, many months not just to prevent that scenario where at the last minute some stranger calls. They've really helped their organizers immerse themselves in the communities.
Last thing, any advice for the New York State Assembly leaders? What a mess they're in now with the Vito Lopez scandal, and it's reaching all the way to Sheldon Silver, the speaker, and how he handled it, and how the money was paid to the victims of the sexual harassment, and et cetera. Are they beyond advice?
Well, I don't think so. I think, I went to prison because I didn't come clean immediately. Had I said immediately after my 2004 campaign, yes, I knew that my aides met with this guy. I didn't know the content of their meetings, and I didn't know what the mailer was going to look like, but I did know they met with him. I wouldn't have gone to prison. Obviously, Speaker Silver didn't handle it that way initially, but he's got another chance here as the investigation broadens from just Lopez's behavior out to the way that the Assembly at large handled it. I think he's got a chance to maybe redeem himself by explaining, exactly what he knew, when he knew it, and how it all transpired. And if that happens, I hopefully he would be able to hold on to his speakership.
Real quick, you're working on your memoir. Why do you call yourself a recovering politician? It implies that it's an alcoholic-like state and you can't stop yourself from running again.
Well, I think my wife can stop me from running again. But I will say this. When people catch the bug, it's very hard to let it go. I still love politics. I still get up and I've got 4 newsletters that come to my inbox before 7 o'clock in the morning, that is the first thing I do every day. So I'll never stop loving politics, and I'll never stop wanting to have an impact on public policy in my home state of Missouri and wherever I can. But there are things about public life that I think are deleterious to human beings. And we talked about the advice that I'd give spouses, and a lot of people in public life, they just forget what the most important things in the world are. They lose track of priorities, and I think that's why we call it the recovering politician, because getting out of it allows you to see in a much more lucid way what's really important in the world.
Well, thank you for sharing your story and your advice.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me, Brian.
Up next, something in the party platforms that could wake you from that internet startup dream. Internet freedom. Those words have been included by both Democrats and Republicans this year in their election platforms. But freedom for whom and from what? What separates the parties' internet pledges matters to startups, big players, and you. Joining us from the nation's capital to help tease out the differences is Gigi Sohn, co-founder and president of the internet activist group, Public Knowledge. Thank you so much for joining our show. Hello from New York.
Hey, Brian, good to be here.
Does the term internet freedom mean different things to Democrats and Republicans?
I think so. I think for Democrats, or at least progressives, internet freedom means the ability for the internet user to use their internet connection any way they see fit without gatekeepers, be they cable companies or telephone companies or Hollywood studios interfering and controlling their internet experience. So it's about you and I controlling what we want to see and what we want to do with the internet. I think for more conservatives and Republicans, it's more about freedom from regulation, including competition regulation, including the kind of regulation that ensures that the telephone and cable companies and the Hollywood studios don't interfere with your internet experience.
So I think you tend to come down more on the side of the issues that the Democrats identify with. Tell us why that is and why you think the Republicans are wrong for wanting the government to stay out of the internet, and maybe that's the way to have a wild, open, and free internet.
Well, I wouldn't say I'm 100% in accord with the Democrats, and there are some issues, frankly, where we're more in accord with Republicans. So I think that's important to say off the top of the bat. But here's another very, very important point, is when I talk about the Federal Communications Commission or other bodies ensuring that consumers control their internet connection, I'm not talking about regulating the internet. Okay, I'm talking about regulating the on-ramps to the internet. Just like the telephone system has been regulated for 100 years, that's what we're talking about. So, since the very, very beginning of communications law, it was essential that there be protections so consumers wouldn't have to worry about their telephone call not getting answered or getting answered more slowly than another person's telephone call, maybe somebody with more money. And this is really the same thing. It's about ensuring that when I connect to the internet, some websites don't pay for the privilege of coming up faster or coming up with better quality of service. That's what that's about. That is not regulation of the internet. I think it's a very, very important distinction. Now, let me get back to your original point. I do agree, my organization does agree with Democrats on the need to have consumer protections, or what they call net neutrality protections, to ensure an open internet where users have control. Where we very much don't agree with Democrats is in the intellectual property copyright protection space, where, frankly, Democrats have been in a lot of ways worse than Republicans in the relentless march to greater and greater copyright enforcement, which does impact speech. When you start, as the Obama administration has done, taking down websites that you believe to be infringing when actually they are not, you are impacting speech. And they've not only taken down these websites, they've held them from the lawful owners for over a year in several cases. So that is definitely a free speech issue, and where we absolutely don't agree with the Democrats. And while the Republicans aren't perfect on copyright enforcement, they do see copyright as the type of regulation that gives them pause. So they tend to actually be better on some of the copyright enforcement issues than the Democrats are.
What does this all mean for people who want to launch startups, who aren't Google today but hope to be the next Google someday? I know I was talking to one smaller ISP provider, internet service provider, who was saying the so-called net neutrality actually locks him out of competing with the big guys who provide a lot of internet access right now.
I don't actually know how that's possibly the case. I mean, the reason that small ISP is locked out is because the government has allowed so many mergers and gotten rid of policies that have allowed now AT&T and Verizon control the wireless space. You essentially have a duopoly. And cable companies like Comcast and Time Warner Cable, they have regional monopolies. And that's why this ISP is out of luck. It has nothing to do with net neutrality. Look, there was a time about 12 years ago where if you were the dominant telecommunications provider in an area, you had to make your facilities available to competing ISPs. That's why, if you remember, in the dial-up days, the average American had access to 13 different dial-up internet service providers. Now you're lucky if you've got access to 2. I talk to people in San Francisco all the time, and they say, if I want really high-speed internet, I've got a choice of Comcast or Comcast. So it's very interesting because, as I said, in like the late 90s and the early aughts, we had these policies that required competition, required the AT&Ts and Verizons of the world to open up their networks to AOL and Mindspring and Earthlink. I don't know if your viewers remember those names.
I remember those. I think I owned access or bought access to at least 3 of them at one time or another.
Right, and then in like 2002, the FCC decided that that was no longer good policy, and now we have the situation we have now where we have monopoly and duopoly. And what's interesting is if you go around the world, particularly in Europe, they adopted those what we call open access policies. And if you go to England, in some places you have a choice of like 40 different internet service providers. So it's really unfortunate that we exported those policies and dumped them ourselves, and we find ourselves in a very, very poor competitive position, which means that, number one, prices are high, speeds are slow, and when you look at any international comparison of broadband speed and value, we usually come in somewhere between 15th and 20th.
Wow.
It's really, it's a shame.
So should I assume that since both presidential campaigns have bothered to take a position on this on their website, different though they may be, that there are companies or industries on each side throwing money at those positions?
Oh, absolutely. Well, I would say on both sides they're throwing money. I mean, there's money on both sides. You have on the one hand, like I said, sort of the incumbent telecommunications and cable companies who like that bottleneck control, and they're obviously throwing money on the one hand. But on the other hand, you do have what we call the edge providers, the Googles, the eBays, the Yahoos. You know, they need an open network. If all of a sudden, you know, Comcast is going to say to Google or say to Yahoo, you know, you want good quality of service for your website, you want it to come up faster, you have to pay us. You know, as rich as those companies are, they don't really want to do that because, frankly, it goes against sort of the open, what they call end-to-end nature of the internet. Again, where there's nobody in the middle controlling the experience. You know, if you're a good developer, if you develop a good website or a good application, you should be able to win on that, not because you can afford or not afford to pay the internet service provider for faster speeds or better quality of service.
Last thing, are you in favor, and is either party in favor of this idea that I've heard of the UN getting involved in regulating the domain names?
Let me clarify. It's not quite that, okay? So there is a body of the UN called the International Telecommunications Union. And it is this year in Dubai in December updating the treaty that governs the International Telecommunications Union. It's called the ITRs, International Telecommunications Regulations. Some countries are proposing to give the ITU power over internet governance and power over internet regulation. And neither party is for that. Both are against it. This is one of these rare, what I call kumbaya moments, where civil society groups like ours, companies like Verizon, AT&T, Google, and others are all in agreement that it is not good policy to centralize, you know, international control of the internet in this one body. There's a lot of reasons why different countries want to do this. Some of them are legitimate. Some of them are very illegitimate. Some countries, some repressive regimes want to be able to control speech over the internet. That's completely illegitimate. There are other countries, like the African countries, that see that perhaps the ITU could get them more money through some of the regulations. While I think that's a legitimate concern, I do think in the end it's not something that we want. So, you know, internationally, the internet has generally been governed by what they call multi-stakeholder bodies. So that is, you have bodies that include all different industries and engineers and civil society, and they come to consensus over how the internet should run. I think the last thing you want is a bunch of bureaucrats who know very little about the technology trying to govern the internet, and both parties are united in that very, very, very strongly.
Kumbaya in Washington, at least over fighting UN control of the internet. Thank you very much for joining us. Very illuminating.
It's a pleasure.
Up next, spelunking in the city. What did you do last night? Well, I can guarantee it was nothing like what our next guests have been up to. Eric Ruggiero and Joe Anastasio are both members of LTV Squad, the longest-running organized urban exploration group in New York City. They recently went spelunking under Grand Central Terminal to explore and document the rarely seen Trolley Loop there. Reminder before we get started, do not try these dangerous tricks at home. But we'll see some images of what they found down there and talk about the whole idea of urban underground spelunking. Hi guys, welcome to the show.
Oh, thanks for having us.
So I will bite. What do the initials LTV stand for?
I'll feel that one. Back in the 1980s, when every kid in New York City had a graffiti tag, they also, you know, they'd form into little groups and they'd have like a 3-letter name for their little gang that they'd call themselves. So there were dozens of these all around town, and the one that me and my friends started was License to Vandalize.
Ooh.
So that was the original name, but it could mean anything. You know?
But you don't vandalize, you go exploring
Exactly.
in the subway tunnels.
Yes.
Yes. I guess when I put the website together, because I also do website work, I just couldn't think of a better name for the domain name. I used to be a graffiti artist growing up, but not now. You know, that pretty much ended when I was 18 and had a very close call with the police. And I was like, my mom will be very upset if I go to jail.
Yeah, I guess so. So let's show the viewers an image of a subway tunnel. This is the Trolley Loop, and oh my goodness, it looks like a haunted house on Halloween. What are we looking at?
Indeed. This is, it's a very small subway tunnel segment right under Grand Central, pretty much 42nd Street and Park Avenue. The 7-line subway, as we all know it today, was actually built originally as a trolley tunnel just between Long Island City and Grand Central. And at the end of the tunnel, there was this small little loop track because the train didn't have a cab on each end like today. You know, they just come into the station, back right out. They'd have to go around this little loop because you'd have to keep the cab on in front of the train.
So that's the loop. And so what do? You go down there and you document what it looks like in various obscure subway tunnels?
Yeah, all over the city. And this is just one little part, actually a very undocumented part. Not many people have been down there or visited it or documented it anyway. But most of what we do is just all over the tunnels, Bronx, Brooklyn, Manhattan, Queens, wherever there seems to be interesting spaces or I personally like to go down there and find old pieces of graffiti. Not a lot of people write down there anymore, so you can find some really old stuff from way back in the day that otherwise would have been destroyed or painted over or you know, just gone now in other locations because it's, you know, they don't really touch things down there.
Let's take a look at another image and tell us what we're looking at here. I think I'm in church.
Yeah, you know, this one I'm not entirely sure. This was at the end of the loop. There was this kind of new block basically blocking the loop tunnel going back around to the 42nd Street platform. And I'm not sure what it was, why it's there, but it's pretty much blocking where the train went. So
This looks very light, like whatever that structure is in the lower left-hand corner looks very well illuminated. Why is that?
that, I'm assuming that this is like a new pipe that they ran through there, and that's like a new support. It seems like the MTA does actually maintain certain things in these tunnels, but I'm not entirely sure the history of that particular structure.
So what's the thrill for you? He was telling us why he likes crawling around down there and what he's looking for. How about for you?
Well, it's really a matter of especially for the trolley tunnel, growing up, coming back to Queens, because I grew up in Queens, I would take 7 train back all the time, and I would always see it from, like, you know, the side of the train, like, what is that? What's back there? So it's really just a innate curiosity of what's in these little hidden spaces that the public rarely ever gets to see.
That's the interesting part that I like about it. It's somewhere that's completely off limits to everybody else, and the only people that really get to see it are the staff that maintain the subway system. So there's a lot of interesting places, and I like the architecture of it as well, because the subway started out as 3 different systems, companies that built them, and they became the MTA in the 1940 or 60?
Yeah,
Was it
40s,
right? But they're all built different ways, so it's interesting when you go down to different parts of the system to see how they connect together and how just how they were built originally. They're built with different methods, and there's all little rooms and things off to the side, and there's always something new to find, and it's just that's
Sounds like an adventure.
yeah.
So let's show another image. And gosh, this looks like it's off limits. What are we looking at here?
Yes, this is the actual Queens-bound 7 train track, and to the
Looking at Queens, so the light at the
Yes.
end of the tunnel there is
The
Queens.
No, this is the light at the end of this tunnel is the Grand Central Station.
Okay.
And to the right would be where the Trolley Loop is. So it's basically just west of Grand Central Station on the 7, between Grand Central and Fifth Avenue.
You were arrested once down in one of these tunnels, right?
Last year, I think it was May, we were up in Harlem in a stretch of the 2nd Avenue subway. There was 3 sections of tunnel that were built back in the 70s.
1970s, yeah.
And then ran out of money and couldn't finish it. And this was one of what I think a couple attempts to build the 2nd Avenue. And they've just been sitting there abandoned for 30, 40 years now. There's not much. There's no station. There's no tiles. There's no tracks. There's nothing. It's mainly just a big concrete hole in the ground, which is very interesting that we ended up getting caught there and not in an active running tunnel in revenue service. Someone saw us going in through a hatch on the street and called the police.
Hey, you.
Yeah,
Did it look like this? We're putting up another image. Did it look something like this?
more like that. Even, well, cleaner than that, actually, because this is, seen service and been sitting for so long.
Are we looking up at the ceiling of
That
a
would be
tunnel?
The ceiling
Yeah.
of a tunnel.
This is the ceiling of the Trolley Loop, and the little metal bracket we see hanging from the ceiling was actually, they used to suspend a 3rd rail from the ceiling instead of on the floor.
Or for the cables.
Yes. Most trolleys run off cables. I'm not sure why they designed this one to not run off cable. Apparently it was a 3rd rail system hanging from the
So I
ceiling.
gather the MTA is not down with you going down there.
Not so far as we know. I mean, I know a lot of rank and file employees who are just, equally as interested and, they're A-okay with it. I'll give you helpful tips of information here and there. They always tell you, be careful, don't do this, don't do that. But the MTA,
People have gotten electrocuted down there.
yes, and the funny thing is we don't know exactly how many. The MTA only recently, seems like this past summer, started publicizing how many people get killed in the subway. It seems like a lot of
Workers, though,
suicide.
not spelunkers like
No,
you,
no,
right?
Civilians and
Oh, yeah?
anybody, any
Yeah.
incident that happens.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, it seems, I think if any spelunkers ever got killed down there, we'd know about it. I know
Never
of
heard
none.
anybody.
Yeah, I only know of maybe half a dozen graffiti artists since the 80s that really got killed down there.
How many people like you are there who go and root around in the tunnels for fun?
Hard to say.
Worldwide or New York City?
No, New York City.
Okay.
From what I know, I'd probably
Yeah.
say
2 dozen at the most.
One of you was
Doesn't-
recently in the Paris tunnels, right? Who was that?
Yes.
I just got back from a trip to Paris a couple weeks
Different?
ago.
Different? Tell me, s'il vous plaît.
They're similar in ways compared to, say, the London Underground, where pretty much if you go in any tunnel there, they're all the same thing. It's a big round metal tube. From what I've heard, I haven't really seen any of it, but it's mostly all the same thing there. Paris is a little bit different. It's built somewhat the same way around, but it's a little more interesting where there's junctions and more graffiti, and sometimes they leave trains down there, and you can walk up close to a sitting train, which is similar to what happens in New York. Whereas some other systems are just kind of boring the same thing over and over and over again.
Do you think the MTA should do something with all these abandoned tunnels? Like there was the High Line, which was a whole lot of nothing, and now it's the coolest place in the world. Is there an underground equivalent of that, potentially?
Well, there was recently, I forget if it was a year or 2 ago already, the Underbelly Project, they called it. There was a set of artists in Brooklyn who found one of these abandoned stations, and it was accessible enough that they could bring artists. They brought in like 100 different artists to paint this abandoned station. Each one did their own little mural, and it's still sitting up there, abandoned, off limits. The only people who'll ever see it are MTA workers, unless the MTA actually decides to maybe give the Transit Museum or someone, give them authority to hang a few lights in there and make it into something public.
I think the problem is that there's the MTA themselves doesn't have the money to do something like that, or
Yeah,
it's
I
not
was
a
thinking
big
that.
priority to them.
They have
much bigger.
running enough trains and buses to spend their money on.
Yeah, there's plenty of other things that are probably more important than opening up some little space to the public to see as an art museum or whatever it may be. Or there was something recently about another trolley terminal on, was it Essex Delancey?
Yes.
On the J. There's a big space there that they were talking about trying to figure out some way to turn it into an underground park, but it would just cost enormous amounts of money.
And if they did that, then it wouldn't be such an outlaw thing to do, and you guys would lose your interest.
No,
Maybe not.
because it would
for
only be
you,
that
or-
one little space.
Yes.
You know, there's still plenty of other
Right.
places
Well, if they
to go
did it
and
on
things
a
to see.
large scale.
Well, when it comes to like the High Line, that used to always be like a fun place to go, and now it's like, oh, now it's just a park
In that
full of
sense,
tourists.
yes. Now it's yeah.
Well, thank you for sharing some of your secret world with us. Thank you.
No
Thanks
problem.
for having us.
And that's our program for today. We premiere a new show every Wednesday evening at 7:30 here on CUNY TV. Next week, another edition of Debate This, Poverty, an issue that has fallen off the presidential radar. And tune into my radio program on WNYC 93.9 FM and AM 820 at 10 a.m. weekdays. Tomorrow, we begin our election series, 30 Issues in 30 Days, with a look at the long-term unemployed. I'm Brian Lehrer. Talk to you then.